Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to be here today as a guest of Grant Thornton back in Christchurch after the budget. And can I say, before I get into the presentation about the budget, how much we admire the resilience of the Christchurch business community. The government's been closely involved since September in efforts to support business in Christchurch, because that's where the jobs and the incomes come from. Christchurch business has been just so much more resilient than we might have expected, and I'd have to say that's made our job easier, but just more importantly, I think for the community of Christchurch, it's meant that people have fairly quickly rebuilt their confidence in the economic strength of the city. Of course that's got a long way to go, and of course that's going to take a while, but actually going back a couple of months, I don't think any of us would have guessed that at this stage, for instance, we'd only have an extra 700 to 1,000 people on the unemployment benefit in Christchurch, when the employment support subsidy for a while had over 50,000 people on it. It's just amazing how businesses have found solutions, and we have benefited enormously from the advice of the business organisations here, and they consistently advocated that we act quickly and generously, and by doing that we think between us we're able to create the opportunity for businesses just to have a bit of time to think about how they were going to reorganise themselves. That is actually one of the key parts of the budget, has been to absorb the costs, or provision and absorb the costs of the Canterbury earthquake, at the same time as sorting out the government's books. I think it's important to see this budget in the context of the last 3 years. Our media and commentary cycle and our political cycle is quite a lot shorter than economic cycles. The challenges we are dealing with alongside the earthquake here in Christchurch have built up, some of them over 20 or 30 years in New Zealand, and certainly over the last 10 years, where our economy has got significantly out of balance, and it took a good decade for that to happen. And we started out with the budget in 2009 on a longer road to recovery and to rebalancing. And our analysis about the economy in this budget is the same as it was back in 2009. And that is that we've got to shift people and capital from our domestic sector, where we had excessive consumption, excessive housing speculation, all funded by excessive borrowing, into savings, investment and exports, and real profitable earnings from selling things to the rest of the world. Pretty straightforward plan, but one that needs to be focused on for budget after budget, year after year, if we're going to absorb the unexpected events and eventually get this economy onto a footing where you get ahead by earning, not by borrowing. And for many New Zealanders, they understand that, and I'll show you some evidence of that on the way through. So budget 2011 is part of that picture, and if we're re-elected, then budget 2012 will be another step along the same road. With respect to budget 2010, time slips by pretty quickly, but we implemented the largest tax reform in 25 years in that budget, and the last significant step in that was put in place only 7 weeks ago. That is the 1st of April this year, with a cut in the company tax rate and a number of other detailed changes that have been implemented as part of the package of cutting income taxes and increasing consumption taxes. And you can see the focus for budget 2011 is around the deficit track for the government, rebuilding Christchurch and higher national savings. Now, the deficit this year is the biggest deficit New Zealand's ever had. We've been out there borrowing a bit faster than we needed to because conditions, particularly in the last 3 or 4 months, have been quite favourable. And we've been borrowing $380 million on average per week for the last 12 months. Some weeks $1 billion. Over in the next financial year, it'll drop from $380 million a week to $100 million a week, which will be the average for the next 3 years. And you can see there we get back to surplus. In 4 years we have a significant surplus where we can start making a few choices that we certainly don't have now. So we've taken a pretty considered approach where year after year we've made progress. So the dotted line there is the first set of forecasts I saw as a Minister of Finance, which showed never-ending deficits from 2008 till at least 2022-24, and that was clearly unsatisfactory. The first is the overall vulnerability of New Zealand to foreign debt markets. I think I showed you a picture last year which indicated that New Zealand is one of the most indebted countries in the developed world as a proportion of our GDP. Our government debt is relatively low, our private sector debt is quite high. And we want to be less vulnerable to those unpredictable financial markets. We currently owe them $170 billion, and it's going up pretty rapidly at the moment, but it will flatten out. The second bit of that context is that for sovereign borrowers, the world seems to be dividing itself into 3 bands. So if you're over 60% of GDP, you should be in trouble, but as long as you're the US or the UK, you seem to be able to get away with it, at least for now. If you're somewhere between 30% and 60%, well, that's where a small indebted country like us should not be, because it means you're getting attention of the markets, and when they start getting worried about you, it gets expensive. We've set up the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Fund, and you can see the dollar amounts there. There's really 2 reasons for doing this. One is to give you the reassurance that New Zealand is behind Christchurch and that we have the money we need to rebuild Christchurch. When you put our $8.8 billion alongside the insurance flows, you can see why what happens in Christchurch is going to matter to the economy, because one way or another, 15 to 20 billion has to be spent in Christchurch. Long run, the growth of that export sector is critical, because we are a carriage in the China-Australia train. Our 2 biggest markets soon will be the 2 fastest growing economies in the world, and that is a huge opportunity. While people have had their confidence knocked around, actually out there in the grassroots, things are starting to move, because, for instance, if you're a manufacturer selling to Australia, which is our biggest market, things have never been better. You've never been more competitive than you are today with the way the exchange rate is. I was in China 3 or 4 weeks ago speaking to the leadership of the Chinese government, the people will be the leaders number 1 and number 2 next year. They have an express wish to see our trade with China double from 10 billion to 20 billion in the next 5 years.